Hello my juniors, welcome to another embryological lecture series. It's your great science tutor Lorenzo. I'll be discussing the embryology of the hindgut. So we have discussed the embryology of the foregut, the midgut, so we are treating the hindgut today. So if you are just new to my channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on your post notification button so that anytime I drop any video, you'll be sure to be notified. And if you want me to make a video for you, put it down in the comment section. When I look at it, I'll make sure to give you the video. Now let us jump right into the video. So before you come here, make sure you have watched my foregut, formation of all the organs of the foregut, the midgut, and now is the hindgut. So let us jump right into it now. So in this video, we'll be talking about the hindgut. So in our previous video, I talked about the organs of the foregut, the organs of the midgut. So we'll be talking about the organs of the hindgut. So in the hindgut is very simple. The hindgut begins from the left 1/3 part of the transverse colon down to the orifices of the anal canal. So in the foregut, we say the foregut is beginning from the pharyngeal gut, which is the pharyngeal or the primitive pharynx, down to the outgut of the liver bud. Don't forget. While the midgut continues from the outgut of the liver bud down to the right 2/3 and left 1/3 part of the transverse colon. So since you have understood this now, in the hindgut subsequently develops into the what? The right 1/3 part of the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. In the anal canal is the upper 2/3 part of the anal canal. So all these things are formed when endodermal cells begin to proliferate to form all these tubes. Don't forget. So now what you want to understand now, the distal part, which is the cloaca membrane, the distal part of the foregut is the cloaca membrane. Now this cloaca membrane now is endodermal cavity. It is an endodermal cavity. The cloaca membrane is an endodermal cavity which is covered anteriorly or covered ventrally by the surface ectoderm, by the surface ectoderm, which develops later into the protoderm. Perfect. The cloaca is an endodermal cavity that is covered outside or externally by the surface ectoderm that develops into the protoderm. So since you have understood this now, in between the cloaca membrane, which is endodermal, and the surface ectoderm, there is an intermediary called the cloaca membrane. So the cloaca membrane is separating the endodermal cavity of the cloaca and the surface ectoderm. So this cloaca membrane is very, very important. Now what you have to know now, that if the terminal part of the hindgut migrate posteriorly in the posterior region of the cloaca, it forms what we call the anorectal canal, because the cloaca have an anterior region and a posterior region. So if the terminal part of the hindgut migrates in the posterior region of the cloaca, you form the anorectal canal. But if the allantois migrate anteriorly in the anterior region of the cloaca, you form the urogenital sinus. So we have the urogenital sinus in front and the anorectal canal at the back. The urogenital sinus in front and the anorectal canal at the back. Now what is separating these two structures? The two structures are separated by an endodermal structure called the urorectal septum. So the urorectal septum separates the allantois, which give rise to urogenital sinus, and the hindgut, which gives rise to the anorectal canal. This urorectal septum now, what happens? It is mesoderm. So what happened during continued proliferation and the cordial folding? What happened? The tip lies close to the cloaca membrane. So we got urorectal septum from the intermediary between the allantois in front, which give rise to the urogenital sinus in front, and at the back, and the anorectal canal at the back. So this intermediary is the uro in front, urorectal septum, which is mesodermal. During cordial folding, what did I tell you? The tip of this urorectal septum begins to lie close to the cloaca membrane. And I told you the cloaca membrane is the separation of the endodermal cavity of the cloaca and the surface ectoderm. And as it begins to lie close to it, what happens? At the end of the 7th week, what happens? Think about it. The cloaca membrane begins to rupture in the front and at the back. The cloaca membrane begins to rupture in the front and at the back. As it begins to rupture on the front, it marks the opening for the urogenital sinus, and at the back the opening for the anorectal canal. So there's an opening at the front, the urogenital sinus, and the opening at the back, the anorectal canal. So now the tip of this urorectal septum, the tip of the urorectal septum, what happens to it? It forms the perineal body. It forms the what? The perineal body. So since it forms the perineal body, what happens? So the upper to third part of the anal canal, we remember, is formed by endoderm. I was telling you in the beginning what the hindgut forms. Now the hindgut is endodermal already, which lines all the tubes I've mentioned: the transverse colon, which is the 1/3 of the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the upper to third part of the anal canal. They are all lined endodermally. Also, this hindgut, the endodermal structure of the hindgut, also line the bladder and the urethra. So don't forget. So now the upper to third part of the anal canal is lined by endoderm, but now the lower one, what happens? The ectodermal cell that is lining the outer surface of the cloaca forms the protoderm that I told you, and the protodermal cells, which is the ectodermal cells, begins to migrate into the anorectal canal. As they begin to migrate into the anorectal canal, what happens? They form the lower 1/3 part of the anal canal. The protodermal cells, which is the ectodermal cell, begins to migrate inwardly, forming the lower 1/3 part of the anal canal. So now, what is separating them now? The cloaca membrane is separating the upper to third, which is the endoderma, and the lower 1/3, which is the ectoderma, formed by the protoderm. Very simple. Then with time, what happens? This cloaca membrane, or they call the anal membrane, begins to degenerate. It doesn't last for a long time. It degenerates away. As it continues to degenerate, what happens? It forms a pectinate line. The pectinate line just marks the division of the upper to third part of the anal canal and the lower 1/3. The upper to third, the endoderm; the lower 1/3, ectoderm. From protoderm. Now, one thing you have to know now: the upper to third is supplied by the superior rectal artery, which is a branch of the inferior mesenteric artery, while the inferiorly it is supplied by the inferior rectal artery, a branch of the internal pudendal artery. Different origin. Now, since you also know now, this intermediary separated by the pectinate line is lined superiorly, which is the endoderma, by the columnar epithelium. It's lined by columnar epithelium, while in the inferior part, formed by the surface ectoderm, is lined by simple squamous. Don't forget it. So it's so easy. Don't forget it. So in the clinical correlation of the hindgut, so what are the embryonic abnormalities, congenital abnormalities that affect the hindgut? The first thing we'll be looking at is what we call the recto-ureter or recto-vaginal fistula. Now, this case occurs in 1 to 5,000 births when there is an abnormality in the structure of the urorectal septum, which is a mesodermal structure that separates the allantois, which give rise to the urogenital sinus, and the hindgut, which give rise to the anorectal canal. So this urorectal septum, if there is an abnormality in its formation, or there is an abnormality in the cloaca, it can give rise to recto-ureter or recto-vaginal fistula. Now, in this case, when the cloaca is too small, or the urorectal septum doesn't move far away during folding, what happens? It will cause the opening of the hindgut to open in the ureter or the vagina. So there will be an opening of the hindgut in the vagina or the ureter. If the urorectal septum doesn't move away during folding, the opening will change. Remember, the opening was caused when the cloaca membrane opens in the front and at the back, causing the urorectal septum to be in the middle to form the perineal body. So if the urorectal septum doesn't move far away during this opening, what happens? The hindgut will open in the ureter of the vagina. So next is the imperforate anus. The imperforate anus is caused when the cloaca membrane separating the upper to third endodermally and the lower 1/3 ectodermally, if the membrane doesn't degenerate, if the membrane is there till birth, what happens? It will cause imperforate anus, which means the waste cannot be passed by the newborn fetus. So we have discussed the recto-ureter and the recto-vaginal fistula, and we have discussed the imperforate anus. The next one is the congenital megacolon. What's congenital megacolon? The congenital megacolon is caused when there is an absence of the parasympathetic ganglia in the ventral or dorsal wall of the bowel. What is the bowel? The gut tube. So when there is absence of parasympathetic ganglia, it causes congenital megacolon. Now the ganglia are developed from the what? The neural crest cells, and they migrate from the neural folds down to the wall of the bowel. So if they are not present, if there's an absence of the RET gene that is necessary or that is stimulated for the migration of these neural crest cells, if they are out, what happens? The baby can develop congenital what? Megacolon. And this RET gene is what? Is a part or is a type of the tyrosine kinase receptor. The RET gene is a type of the tyrosine kinase receptor that is needed to migrate the what? The ganglia from the neural folds to the what? To the bowel. So if there's absence of it, what happens? The child or the fetus will develop what? Congenital megacolon. And now in most cases it affects the rectum. In most cases it affects the rectum. But in 80%, it affects the mid part of the sigmoid colon. It affects the mid part of the sigmoid colon. Only in 2 to 3%, it affects the entire colon. Only in 2 to 3%. In 20 to 30%, it affects the transverse colon and the right-sided colonic segment. In 20% to 30%, it affects the what? The transverse colon and the right-sided colonic segment. In 80%, in the midpoint of the sigmoid colon, in most cases the rectum, and in 2 to 3% the entire colon. So I hope it all made sense to you and you understand the development of the hindgut that I just explained. Now we're moving to the what? The formation of the bladder and the what? The urethra. Why? Because they go through the same route. They go through the same route. Don't forget.